You're listening to the Jōrni Podcast. How do you survive unimaginable betrayal, protect your children, and fight back against a master manipulator? Join me for this profound story that's larger than life in today's episode. This episode contains adult subject matter, and some listeners may be triggered by this content. Listener discretion is advised. Hi, I'm Petra Brunbauer, and with decades of experience with sadness, pain, anxiety, and stress, I finally figured out how to leave all that behind. And this podcast shows you how to break free permanently so you can reclaim your sanity and find the self-esteem and energy to go after the life you desire. With real talk about mental health, holistic healing, and the tough journey of coming out the other end. This is the Jōrni Podcast. Welcome to today's episode. In this episode, we explore an incredible story of resilience and justice as one woman takes on a system that failed to protect her children. What began as an escape from a toxic marriage led to an unimaginable fight for safety and accountability, a battle that pushed her to her limits and revealed the cracks in the very system meant to serve justice. Victoria Ellen looks the part of a successful career woman, but she has led a life that is even more intense than her striking blue eyes seem to suggest. Behind the scenes, she spent more than a decade relentlessly pursuing justice for her children, a battle that led to the Ohio Supreme Court and beyond. She started out as a divorced single mother struggling to get by after escaping a toxic marriage. She and her children spent years in therapy to overcome the trauma they endured. After traveling that bumpy road, Victoria became an award-winning businesswoman, a happily married wife, and the proud mother of 2 thriving college students. Now, she and her family are candidly and courageously disclosing their transformative tale. It's a story that exposes how the justice system, which was designed to help people, can ironically be manipulated to silence the cries of victims. Victoria was devoted to being the voice of her children when they were too young to speak for themselves. Even when they were older, the children felt that the court system disregarded their rights, and, incredulously, their mother was sentenced to jail for passionately advocating on their behalf. Through it all, Victoria relied on her faith, intelligence, and raw determination, and now basks in victory on every level. She has found true love. She has found happiness and success. She has found her destiny. And she hopes that by sharing her story, she can help you do the same. Here's my interview with Victoria Ellen. Hi, Victoria Ellen. It's so great to have you on the podcast today. I've been looking forward to getting to chat with you because we are going to be talking about breaking the system today. And that sounds a little bit mysterious, but I have to tell our listeners this will be an absolutely incredible personal story that you will be sharing with us. And I can't wait for you to do that. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Petra. I'm really, really excited to be here.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And I feel so fortunate to have you here today to share that story because I know that this will touch a lot of lives and it will touch a lot of our listeners as it has touched me. So thank you for your willingness to share that and put that into the world. And would you like to start us off a little bit, maybe? Is there a beginning to your story or sort of starting point that you think of when you think back of what's happened over the years? Maybe you want to share that with listeners for starters, and then we'll connect that up to what happened and what is happening today, if that works for you.
Yes, that works. So when I think about the beginning of this story, it takes me back to being a young girl in college, my sophomore year of college, and meeting someone that I ended up being married to and starting a family with. And rewinding the hands of time, that's been about 25 years now. So late 1999. And when I think about just how this culminated, it started with a relationship and really just kind of being thrust into adulthood when I really thought I'd had some more time to just really get through college, have a career, and kind of start my own life. Things don't always turn out the way that you plan, right, Petra? So going back, I was in a relationship with a man that portrayed himself to be very charismatic, good looking, and I'm young, and he just was easy to talk to. And I was raised pretty sheltered, only child in a really rural area in Ohio. And he had this larger than life personality. So anyway, we became fastly involved into this relationship. And not long after, maybe about 9 months to a year, I found out that I was pregnant. And that kind of just forced me into making some really tough decisions. My family was not a fan of the man that I was dating, and my mother had warned me actually. And I was young. So when you're 19, 20 years old, you think you have all the answers. And I didn't slow down. I had my foot on the gas and pedal to the metal. And then once I found out I was pregnant, I felt like I needed to get married and do the right thing with air quotes. Unfortunately, the relationship started quickly going in the wrong direction as soon as I got married. And I realized that I had married someone that I thought existed, but actually it was just really a character in his play. And the person that he really was started to shine through. My ex-husband's name was Daryl. He was extremely abusive and controlling, and he controlled every single area of my life, even to who I was allowed to talk to on the phone, whether I was allowed to leave the house or not, whether I was allowed to drive my car, whether I could open the drapes or the blinds in our home. They should always remain closed, what I was allowed to eat. Just literally every single area of my life was controlled. And I knew this wasn't healthy, but I was so young and I had just had a baby. I was just a few days before I was due when I ended up getting married. So you don't know what to do at that point because you just feel like I have left my entire family for this man, and I'm now a mom, and now I'm a wife, and I live in a new town, a new city, and I have to figure it out. I've chosen my bed, I have to lie in it. And it's just a very alone feeling. And then the relationship continued to spiral downward out of control and lots of abuse. And that's kind of when, over the course of a couple of years, I just felt like I couldn't take much more. And I started finding out that my son was being physically abused, and it was all kind of in the name of God. He was extremely religious, and he would use the Bible and scriptures almost like as a weapon against me. So a wife should submit to her husband and spare the rod, spoil the child, when my son had bruises on him from the punishment that he would exercise on him as a 1-year-old baby. So just lots of abuse. And then I ended up pregnant with our second child, and my son started displaying signs of sexual abuse. And that was kind of the turning point for me. I had no idea how I was going to escape such a toxic relationship. I had isolated myself because of all of his mandates and really felt alone because I didn't think I could tell my family what I was really experiencing. And at that point, having a 2-year-old displaying signs of sexual abuse was my worst nightmare. And that was when I doubled down and figured out that I have got to escape. I don't know exactly when, but I definitely had my radar up, and I was overly cautious, overly protective, and really just trying to do everything that I could to protect my son and my unborn baby and myself. And I ended up escaping when I was 8 months pregnant, and my son was just shy of his third birthday. I'm going to fast forward because, Petra, this is a really long story, but I was in litigation for about 3.5 years after I escaped. And the court system really, really failed me. It also failed my children. And unfortunately, because of coercive control by my ex-husband, I was already a victim. My children were victims, and we were left to fend for ourselves in a really, in my opinion, rigged system with corrupt government officials and corrupt police officers, and no one to be a voice for my children or for me. After my children came home from a visit with him, they came home with visual signs of sexual abuse. And unfortunately, still, the system failed us. And no one was ever held accountable for the atrocities and the heinous crimes that were committed against my children. But my ex husband at that time stopped fighting me in court. And he went dark for about 10 years until 2015. And that's when he came back from, I'll say, the proverbial dead, because he was still alive, but he had been dead to us for almost a decade. And I had worked tirelessly to put my life back together and put the lives of my children back together and try to give them as normal of a life as I possibly could when they had suffered such horrible trauma and abuse. When he came back with a vengeance. And we were involved in 3 different court cases for almost 7 years, a grand total of nearly a decade that we were in litigation. I'm very familiar with the court system by this point and really felt like the system was broken. And my new husband, who was so amazing and so supportive, convinced me to be my own attorney. Now, I did not go to college to be an attorney. I am not an attorney, but at that point, I had had nearly 10 years of just exposure to the legal system. So he was like the MVP, really, because behind the scenes, he was my biggest cheerleader, and he encouraged me to file my own motions and to represent myself as my own attorney. And I was able to take my ex-husband to court, and I was able to expose some of the things that he was doing criminally. So I think for our listeners, it's important that we at least say a little bit of what he was doing. So he was a pastor. He claimed to be a pastor of a church, which we now know was a cult. He was also a prophet, and he was also claiming to be a prince of Ghana, Africa. Yes, it's wild. He was also a CEO of a company that he claimed was a gold mine in Africa, and he was traveling the world financing biofuel refineries in Southeast Asia and all of these things. So wild, wild story. This man claiming to be a prince, a prophet, a pastor, a CEO, a COO, and all of these things. And I was able to get him on the stand. I questioned him and was able to order the transcript, and I delivered it to the feds. And eventually they indicted him on 16 federal charges. It was a nightmare for nearly 20 years. The court failed us miserably. They tried to force my children to do unsupervised visits with their perpetrator. They were dragged through the court system at that latter half for nearly 7 years and forced to do those visits. I was sentenced to jail because the kids wouldn't do overnight visits with their father, the perpetrator, one of their perpetrators. The system really, I felt, was broken, and the victims, who are survivors, were treated so unfairly, and we were treated as we were guilty instead of the defendant really being guilty. So it was a wild ride, and fact is stranger than fiction, we always say. So many people said, Victoria, you really should tell the world your story. And I decided to write a book. And the title is Painting in the Rain, a true story of trickery and triumph. And it's my memoir based in true crime. And my hope is that through sharing the pain that my children and I endured, that none of our pain would be wasted, and that I would be able to share a message of hope to others almost using my book as maybe a blueprint or a guide to help other people who are suffering through domestic violence, abuse, and the effects of narcissism on lives and finding a way to escape.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I'm going to let you take a breath here and just take a moment, because that was a lot. And that took decades of your life and impacted you in unspeakable ways. So thank you for your courage and your bravery for sharing that with us today. And I feel by sharing that story, as you said, you're going to touch lives of some of us who might be afraid to speak up or might feel that isolation or that loneliness that you felt when you didn't know what to do in that situation. So using your book as a blueprint and your experiences to help others, such an incredibly wonderful thing. And let's make the most of that on this podcast as well, and get your story out to our listeners, to as many people as we can. And I'm wondering, in your early years, when you realized that you were in a relationship that was going down the wrong road, and you weren't able to speak to your parents because you were being isolated and you were being controlled, and you reached a point really where a line was crossed that you could not stomach, and you had to make a decision to really change things. Where did you start with that? I imagine this is a very difficult thing that people face in that situation of feeling completely isolated, not knowing who to speak to, who to call, how to even leave, because you have children to think about, finances to think about, how will you survive? So what were these first little steps that you put together, maybe even in your head, of how you were going to leave that relationship? Was there anything in particular that helped you in that situation, or anything in particular that might be helpful to listeners who may also be in that situation?
That's an excellent question, Petra. I feel like in my head, I started strategizing for ways that I could potentially escape, because I knew that once I left, I was never going back to that misery. It needed to be something that was really set in stone. And a friend of mine gave me a book that was called Murdered Heiress Living Witness. It was a very old book, but I read this story of this woman who had escaped. And somehow inside of me, it just sparked just the smallest little spark of flame that inspired me, that if she could get through that, that I could get through what I was going through. And you play through all the scenarios in your mind because, let's be honest, we don't want to be homeless. And we've been living a lie the entire time that we were married to this toxic human being. So then we feel like maybe we've been not truthful with our family and friends. And then now they're going to know the truth and they're going to be mad at us. And you play through all of these different scenarios. And I can just attest to the fact that none of that is true. It's such deception because we're confused in our mind and we've been brainwashed. And when I did leave, everyone welcomed me with open arms, and just the sheer love and compassion and empathy that I felt from so many people, and just sorrow really for what we had endured, was completely opposite of what I had made up in my head about how people would receive me. You have to remember this is in the early 2000s, so it was a much different time then. We didn't have access to the resources that are now available. But when I think about women and people now who are maybe experiencing such a toxic relationship, there are so many resources locally in people's counties throughout the United States, different cities. And I know even abroad internationally, there are victim advocate associations that you can connect with. And I would just recommend trying to do a little recon online for any resources locally for battered women, homeless shelters, domestic violence organizations. There seems to be so many now that are funded locally, and it's amazing. I've partnered with a lot of these just in my state in Ohio, and just to know that there are so many people that are in the wings ready to help you is so encouraging, and you're not alone. You no longer have to be alone in the fight. That right there is a help kind of springboard you into freedom.
Yeah, it sounds like part of that control and what your experience is in that abuse is exactly that. He wants you to believe that you're alone and that under no circumstances could you ever make it if you wanted to leave. And you start to believe that. So breaking that belief and trusting yourself that you can take care and you can get out is probably one of the first things in that whole journey of freeing yourself. Now, your journey was incredibly long. And even after a 10-year break, it started up again. And where do you take that strength from to keep fighting and to keep moving forward? It sounds like you are in a loving relationship now, that you actually found a spouse. That's amazing. So, where did you take that strength from to keep fighting through those abusive times, through the court, the litigation? I mean, money is one thing, the financial burden that all this creates, but there is also a mental and physical burden that this kind of chronic stress and abuse does with you. So, how did you cope with that? And what was helpful to you while you were fighting this battle?
First and foremost, I am really a strong person of faith, and I feel like I really just had to dig deep and rely on my hope and faith that everything is going to work out. I do have this sense of resilience, and I think that people are resilient. Children are extremely resilient. And I did do a lot of different modalities in order to help myself heal. My nervous system was completely shot after all of this. And I was really trying to exercise a lot of self care. So, some of those things look like obviously prayer, meditation, having a great support system around me. My spouse, he is incredible, and having someone that's a cheerleader in your corner that will constantly stand for you. I did do a lot and still do a lot of therapy. So, counseling, therapy, talk therapy, trauma doctors, anything and everything that would help me understand what I had previously gone through, how it had currently affected my nervous system, my mental health, and my physical well being, and educating myself on that. And then really being able to focus on what is my goal. And my goal was to keep my children safe and was to raise two healthy, happy, functional members of society that could contribute to the world, make the world a better place. That was my responsibility from the time that they were born, before their innocence was stolen. I really had to refocus on the goal. And the goal was them. And I knew that once they turned 18, that regardless of what my ex had done, that at 18, they would no longer have to do those horrible visits. So, what could I do to empower them to take agency of their lives, and instructing them to have a voice? And so they were in therapy as well. My son was on other multiple kinds of medications just to be able to stabilize. And I'm all for that when it's necessary. I have also, in the last several years, gotten into a doctor who is a naturopath and utilizing a lot of supplements to help with the overload of cortisol in my body. So I take a ton of supplements to help, and really just nature. We move to a place where I can connect with nature and just literally feel like I'm in an aviary. The sounds of nature around me with birds and just everything that we now have an opportunity to live in has been wonderful for my mental health, my physical well-being, being able to walk and be outside. So, incorporating all these different modalities is so vitally important to help you heal and get out of that stuck chronic inflammation.
That's a really good point, that it doesn't just affect us on that physical level, but it does affect us on all the other different, the emotional, the mental plane, everywhere. And that we kind of need to take care of all these different systems in order to stabilize and begin that healing journey. Thank you for sharing some of those insights. I find that very interesting, and hopefully our listeners also take away some of those nuggets for their own lives on what they could maybe start with in their healing journey. And I want to ask you about the court journey of this, because that was a big part of what you experienced. And I have spoken to several women who were in very abusive relationships before, and their exes also use the court system as a way to try and exert control, get sole custody, try and bleed you dry just by throwing different cases at you until you run out of money or something. This seems to be a very familiar tactic for people to use in order to get what they want out of you, because they think at some point you'll just stop fighting. What would you say to our listeners, or to someone who is in that situation where litigation is a part of that, and you may face jail time, you may face losing your children, or your children might be pushed into a situation like your children were that was unsafe for them? Where should they start? How can they advocate for themselves? Because the system didn't do what it was meant to do for you. It failed you and your children entirely. Is there anything that we can do to advocate for ourselves in those situations?
There is. And I think that I was in the middle of a perfect storm during my court battles. It seemed like I was in the twilight zone because no one was listening, but I definitely was persistent. And that's what I would say to any listeners today is persistence breaks down resistance. Some of the resources that are available to you would be a guardian ad litem, for example, and that's almost like an attorney for your children that can really be a voice for your children. Also, trying to get some type of a psychological evaluation ordered through the court system. Also, a therapist or a family mediator that could be assigned to your family. That is huge. Really reaching out to local authorities, because I had, for example, a protective order, a restraining order in place. And if you do not feel safe and your children are not safe, then you need to utilize the system in order to get something in place that would keep you safe. Talking to victim advocates, because they do have access to resources in the legal system as well. And they do have people that have donated money to help people who are in need. If you don't know that there's someone to help with attorney fees, you don't even think to ask, because it's almost mind boggling that there are resources to actually help pay for these attorney fees, which, to your point earlier, we were bleeding attorney fees and we had no more resources available, which was one of the reasons why I ended up representing myself. Not everyone is able to do that. Knowing that there are victim advocates and there are resources available in a lot of places throughout the United States and abroad that can help you with those fees, definitely ask. And if you don't get the answer you're looking for, then go to the next place and the next place and the next place, because someone will eventually listen to you. You just have to get through the no's until you can get to the yeses.
Thank you for sharing that. And actually, I find that that is a bit of a comfort to know that there are things out there that might help with that, because some listeners might be worried that they may actually lose their children, or they may end up in jail because they cannot pay for what's coming their way in these situations. So it is reassuring to know that there are programs or associations that could be able to help with that, so that you can focus on the things that is important, and that is making your family safe instead of worrying how you will pay for that. So, yeah, thank you for sharing that. Your book, you said it was meant to be a bit of a blueprint for these situations, these journeys. So, would you like to tell us a little bit more about your book? And it came obviously out of your own personal journey and your own personal experiences, but tell us a little bit more about what readers can find in that book and how it could help them.
Thank you. So the book is titled Painting in the Rain. a true story of trickery and triumph. And I really outline in the book the signs and kind of those red flags that sometimes we ignore because we want to think the best about people and we want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And we don't want to think that there are such evil people in the world. But in reality, there are evil people. In reality, there is an evil that exists, and they prey on people who are naive and who do not have their radar up at all. You're not even aware that such atrocities could be committed. I kind of spell out how it unfolded in my journey. And I was just at a book club last night. They read my book and they had me kind of for a Q&A with the author. And one of the things that a lady said was, I was reading the book going, no, don't go there. Don't go there. She said, but I'm a 69-year-old woman. So I knew that you shouldn't go there. But I was talking to you and trying to get you not to go there, but you did it. And so I think for me, trying to spell out some of those kind of warning signs and paying attention to those really big red flags that we sometimes ignore because we want to believe the best in people really needs to be explored at a deeper level. And sometimes we just need to pause and dive a little bit deeper to get to maybe some answers that we don't want to face at that time, but could help save our lives.
That sounds wonderful. And of course, we will link to your book and resources and the show notes as well to make sure that our listeners can find a copy of your book. And I have a feeling this will be a wonderful resource that listeners can tap into if they are in a similar situation, or maybe they know someone who is and would like to help. So this sounds like a wonderful, wonderful book to read, and we will be linking to it. And you also have another very, very interesting project on the go at the moment. And I'm hoping that you're allowed to talk about it a little bit. So by the time this episode airs, I know everything will be live and will be out there, but do you want to maybe touch on that and give listeners a little bit of an insight of what's coming up for you?
Absolutely. In 2025, early in 2025, there will be a new kind of series released. And I finished filming almost like a documentary of my story with my family several months ago. And it is basically articulating kind of the journey that happened when I was married and how we were all conned, and basically how my ex was a con artist, and sharing kind of our story from trickery to triumph. It will be on a major streaming platform in the United States for the US audience. So I'm really excited about that coming up. And I think that it's just the beginning of being able to expose this. Something we didn't mention, but my ex-husband was involved in a federal trial, of course, because of those 16 felonies. Being able to know that we're all safe now and that that's not going to be happening to other people is kind of what the documentary is supposed to outline. So I'm really looking forward to it. I haven't even seen any of the footage yet, so it's going to be great.
That sounds like a great project. And I love hearing personal stories. And it's also great to see them in a documentary where you can actually visually see that journey unfolding and what happened and get some more insight of how that all unfolded. So I'm sure this will be an amazing documentary. And hopefully by the time we air, we'll have a link for you. If you live in the US and you have access, hopefully have a link for you where you can watch this and you can follow Victoria Allen's story through the documentary as well. We'll do our very best to have all that linked up in the show notes for you. It sounds like a project that absolutely needs to be out there in the world. And did your ex-husband face jail time in the end after going through this federal trial? So he's now all squared away and then you can have some more peace and quiet?
Yes, actually, he did. He is in prison. And I don't want to be a spoiler for the story, but he is facing significant federal time in a federal prison. So he's not able to con any more victims or scam people or be able to continue to perpetrate against any other victims. I feel like the wheels of justice were really slow to get moving, but eventually, once they were gaining momentum, we were able to see justice in this situation. And it's definitely a welcome change and the time we've been waiting for a long time, almost 25 years, so we can take a deep breath and just exhale.
Yeah, and you were a large part of that, delivering that transcript in when you cross-examined him in your own court case. So another big, big step that you took in order to make that justice move, because it didn't really move much on its own. So that was very, very brave of you to take that step. And I hope that you and your family can now take that big exhale and actually continue the healing journey. And how is everyone doing in your family now that you look back and you say these things have happened? Potentially, this perpetrator will now be put away for a long time. What does that feel like from your perspective in your healing journey and where you're at now with your nervous system, with your health, with your mental health, your physical health, your happiness, also your connection to life? Do you feel that there is a way forward for you that will allow you to integrate what you've experienced, but not let that hold you back as you're moving forward? Or what does that look like for you today?
Yes, I do. And that was really why I felt so compelled to write the book, because I always say that I don't look like what I've been through. And I feel like if I was just barely hanging on and just living still a life of just darkness, then maybe it wouldn't really be worth sharing. But because we are so, so far from where we used to be, I felt like it was worthy of being shared. My children are excelling in life. I could not be more proud of them. Our daughter is a cadet at the United States Coast Guard Academy, and she's so successful. Our son ended up graduating from college last year, and he is very successful in his own right. And just seeing my family being able to climb out of this dark pit, it has not been easy. I have really committed my life to a lifetime of healing. And I feel like once I graduate from one program, I find some other modality or another program that I can employ so that I can continue healing, because really we are ever evolving. And I feel like that is really the key to happiness, is continuing to help yourself grow and find new ways to be healthy and whole and be able to help other people get to that healthy, whole place as well.
That definitely leaves the door open for hope for our listeners, for people struggling in those situations, for people in these extremely challenging relationships, that there is hope for a way forward, that there is hope for healing, and there is hope for finding joy again, even if it doesn't seem like that's possible, maybe in this situation at the moment. But you are the best example of what is possible going forward. So thank you for sharing that and for putting that light out there for others to see and be able to follow in their journeys, which can be very, very dark places that you're in. So thank you for that. And if our listeners have been inspired by your story and they would like to connect with you, what's the best way to find you? Where can they connect with you? And of course, we'll link to that as well. But what's the best way to reach you?
My website is victoriaellen.co, and that's Ellen E as in Edward, Ellen. I'm also on all social media platforms, victoriaellen.co, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and LinkedIn. And I would love to connect with anyone on any of those places, as well as my website. Just send me an email and happy to connect.
And you do speaking engagements as well to share your story with associations or anyone who would like to engage you for speaking?
Yes, I do. And that's been really one of the greatest opportunities as well, because I really just feel like that's part of the call, coming out of that darkness and then being able to inspire other people. So I speak for a lot of events across the board. I won't tell all the things that I've done, but yes, I'm open to anything and really excited to hear from anyone that would like to connect with me.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. And like I mentioned, we will be connecting everything in the show notes so that you know where you can reach Victoria Allen, where you can find her book, the Mysterious Project documentary coming out. We'll try to link to that as well. So be sure to check the show notes for all that information. And please, if you are facing some of those red flags that Victoria Allen talks about in her book, if your gut feeling tells you there is something not right, or if your family tells you we're very concerned about you, please connect, reach out, because that control and that manipulation will isolate you and make you very lonely. And that's the whole point, is to keep you from moving forward. So please reach out. Reach out to people like Victoria Allen who really understand what you are going through and who can point you in the right direction of maybe the next steps to take. So I just want to leave our listeners with that message of hope that you've given us. And I want to thank you at this point so very much from the bottom of my heart for being here today and sharing your story. It has been an absolute privilege to speak with you. And thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Take care, Victoria Allen, and all the best for you and your family going forward.
Thank you, Petra. You as well.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to listen in. If you enjoy the Jōrni Podcast, please support us by subscribing, sharing on social media, and leaving us a review. We appreciate you. And you can find more of The Jōrni on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and our website, thejorni.com. Sending you love and courage, and see you next time.